Okay, good morning to you all. Welcome to the National School of Government, the second iteration of our masterclass series in the year 2022. We are very glad that you have chosen to join us again on what has become a successful learning process since the beginning of COVID, where thousands of public servants, senior government leaders, civil society, organized labor, business, scholars locally and internationally have chosen to join the masterclass series run by the National School of Government. We are bringing you very prominent scholars who come and engage with South African public servants, elected and appointed, as well as commentators, opinion makers, and other influential people in society. The people we bring here, they have a wealth of experience as bureaucrats, as researchers, as business people. And so the type of information they shared and the insights they bring here, we can call them cutting edge. In fact, you will have to read many books to understand or gain perspective on what will be shared here in a space of an hour and a half. And that is why masterclasses are important. We are delighted as the National School of Government to have Baroness Shafiq this morning. It is 10 o'clock in South Africa and 8 o'clock in London, where she is. She is a director of the London School of Economics and is a former deputy governor of the Bank of England. Otherwise, we know it as the Reserve Bank. She has recently published a book titled What We Owe Each Other, a New Social Contract. This is a very topical matter for us here in South Africa, inside and outside of the public sector, precisely because President Ramaphosa in the State of the Nation address made a call and a commitment to lead and conclude a process involving organized labor, business, community, and government towards the conclusion of a social compact within 100 days, which is expected to expire in the next month of June. And so having the Baroness here come share perspective on the work she's been doing as an academic, but also as a bureaucrat in various positions and one of the leading economists, political economists in the world today, is very crucial to sharpen perspective as South Africa itself grapples with this question of the social compact. And you will see in the interventions we have with our three eminent respondents, which is Dr. Thabile Yoka, who is an alumni of LSC, Dr. Shafiq, Dr. Palile Hotla, former Station General, is very key in the work being done by MISTRA and the other private sector partners on writing of the scenarios. It's called Ndlulamiti, as well as Professor Madoda Figeni, who previously was working on the scenarios project, and he continues to, but now he is also the acting chairperson of the Public Service Commission, where he's leading conversations about the role of public servants themselves in advancing the compact by doing their work diligently, efficiently, according to the principles that are enshrined in the Constitution of the Republic of South Africa. So welcome, Baroness. We are happy to have you here this morning. We are an important institution as a National School of Government, in a sense that our work must be seen in the context of what is the #1 priority of the sixth administration, which is building a capable, ethical, and developmental state And so conversations like the ones we'll be having today are adding on to the work we do together with others in pursuit of this idea of building a capable, ethical, and developmental state. And as they say, thinking is a key ingredient in advancing any of the objectives you want to achieve in the state. And through interactions like these ones, we broaden our horizon. We're able to think deeper and engage with very complex matters like the one the Baroness will be talking about. We've got different faculties, 4 faculties at the NSG. Some of the programs are cross-cutting regardless of the position you hold in the public sector as a whole. And having masterclasses is one of those cross-cutting interventions, because here you could have a president, you could have a very junior public servant, as well as others from outside. In the end, we are hoping that this total experience will help build a public service that is committed, diligent, prudent, ethical, and accountable, masterful, and innovative in a manner in which they pursue the program of action of government. As I said, this is one of those key masterclasses that we have been running as part of the series. These are the 3 respondents. I will not introduce them. You can read up about them if you are keen to do so. We recently had a masterclass on the green transition. We had Danny Rodrigue, as well, one of the leading economists. We had one of the most influential political scientists in Asia today, if not in the world, Professor Zhang Weiwei, where we're bringing perspective from China. We've had Peter Ho, former head of the civil service in Singapore, engaging here, and current and former directors general in the presidency, and several others as well. So we are glad that you have joined us. This is how we do our work, including the master classes. Instead of having them being physical, most of them have moved online. We're making a call to all South African public servants, elected and appointed, to return to the simulator. So by reading what is produced by scholars at LSC, at the NSG, and everywhere else in the world, we are returning to the simulator in order for you to become much more effective in the work that you do. And finally, we are hoping that eventually we'll answer this question of Professor Mapupan, who says China succeeds because of government, India succeeds despite of government. And in this conversation, there is issues of building of the compact and the abilities of those administration to build compact. And we'll ask you, Baroness Shafiq, whether you think that in successful building, conclusion of compact, whether there is an ingredient there which tells us something about the extent to which the state is efficient and is a driver of progress in society. So thank you once again for being here. I will give the opportunity to you now, Baroness, to take us through your presentation, and then we'll go to our respondents. Thank you.
Wonderful. Well, thank you. Thank you so much for that introduction. And it's really such an honor for me to be here to give this masterclass for many, many reasons. One is that I have spent most of my career as a civil servant, either as an international civil servant at the World Bank, the IMF. I also was a national civil servant when I was permanent secretary at the Department for International Development, and of course as a policymaker at the Bank of England. So I identify hugely with the audience that is with us today, and I really applaud the work of the National School of Government for bringing kind of cutting edge knowledge to the frontier of policy making. And I'm also especially pleased that the timing of this discussion is so relevant to the current debate in South Africa about the social compact in South Africa. And I very much look forward to hearing the views of Pali, Tabi, and Somadoda on the potential relevance of some of the arguments in my book to the current debate in South Africa. Now, some people may say, why are we talking about the social contract at a time when we are still struggling with the pandemic? There's a war in Ukraine, there's food and fuel price inflation that is affecting poor households around the world. And some may say, well, there are these urgent problems. How can we think about these longer term? We don't have time to think about these longer term issues. Now, I draw my inspiration from from one of my predecessors at London School of Economics, William Beveridge, who wrote the famous Beveridge Report, which was published in 1942, which created the modern welfare state and the National Health Service in the UK. And he wrote that report when the bombs were still falling on London. And I think, one has to remember there'll never be a quiet moment to shape the future. And for better or worse, this moment is the best moment to rethink the basic set of norms, rules, and obligations that bind individuals, firms, and states together and define what we owe each other, what I call the social contract. And I would also argue that in South Africa, the failings of the social contract are at the heart of many of the policy challenges the country is facing, whether it's unemployment, inequality, the challenges of the climate transition. And renegotiating the framework for defining what citizens owe the state and what the state owes citizens is at the heart of politics and economic policy today in South Africa, as it is in many countries. So first, let me start by defining my terms. What do I mean by the social contract? Let me give you some examples. The question of whether children are raised at home by mothers or grandparents, or does the state provide childcare centers or paid parental leave so that both parents can care for children? How much of healthcare is the responsibility of individuals, and how much of it is provided by the state through insurance or public funding? Do we expect employers to provide contracts with regular hours and benefits such as sick leave or pensions, or do we expect workers and their families to carry the risks of illness and old age? All of those questions are questions that are answered by the social contract. In more traditional societies, what we owe each other tends to be delivered by families and communities. In more advanced economies, the market and the state play a bigger role. But in every society, people are expected to contribute to the common good when they are adults in exchange for being looked after when they're young or old or unable to support themselves. So let me talk you through why I think the modern social contract is broken. Until about the late 20th century, social contracts were built on the premise that families would have a primary male breadwinner and that women would take care of the young and the old. There was a presumption that people would stay married until they died and give birth to children only when married. They would have steady employment with a few employers over the course of a career, and the education and skills that they accumulated in school from age about, let's say, 6 to 20 would be enough to last for a lifetime. And most people would only live a few years after retirement, and the support that they needed in old age would be provided by their families. Now, as I've described those assumptions that underlie many of our current social contracts, many of you are sitting in the audience thinking, this has nothing to do with the world in which I live. Today, half of women are employed in the labor market globally, and that trend is going up. In advanced economies, between a third and a half of marriages end in divorce, and in most developing countries, the rate of divorce is lower but increasing. A growing proportion of children are born outside of marriage. The average worker has many more jobs over the course of a lifetime. In fact, they may work for several employers in the same week, much less in the same lifetime. And technology is going to increase that labor market flexibility over time. And while many developing countries are still transitioning to get more workers into the formal sector, there are growing signs of informality in the labor markets in advanced economies. I sometimes say that, the gig economy is just a cool name for the informal sector. And then, of course, climate change brings massive risks that could disrupt our economies and the sustainability of our societies. I think looking backwards, the biggest disruptors of the social contract thus far have been the changing role of women, which have affected childcare and elderly care, and technology, which has changed work and what we need from our educational systems. Looking forward, I think the biggest disruption to the social contract will come from aging and climate change. So let me start by saying what I think the difference is between the social contract and the welfare state, and many people confuse the two. The social contract reflects all the ways that we organize what we need to deliver collectively through families, communities, employers, and the state. The welfare state is just one mechanism for delivering those common goods. So there's often a misconception that the welfare state is really about redistributing income from the rich to the poor, what I call the Robin Hood function. But the main purpose actually of the welfare state is to redistribute income over our own lives, what I call the piggy bank function. If you think about it, a clever child can't go to a bank and say, please lend me money for my education, and when I earn money after I work, I'll pay you back. A bank won't do that, but the state does. And the state invests in us when we're young, collects taxes from us when we're in the middle of our lives, and then looks after us when we're older. The first slide that I'm going to show you now, and I will ask that be put up if possible. It shows you data from the UK, which is illustrative but typical of most countries. Maybe the next slide, please. Yeah, there you go. It shows how we engage with the state at different ages in our lives and what we put in and what the state gives us in return. And you can see in the early ages, up until about the age of 20, we tend to take money out of the state because the state pays for our education. In the middle of our lives, the big hump is when we are middle-aged and paying tax. And that's when we are usually net contributors to the state. And then at the end of our lives, the state tends to spend more on our health and our pensions. And what's interesting, if you look, for example, at this data in the UK, most people over the course of their lives take out from the state as much as they put in. Many people think, well, the wealthy, they pay more tax, so they are a net contributor. But of course, the wealthy tend to live longer, and so they benefit more from pensions and healthcare in old age for longer. But in generally speaking, that is that piggy bank function of the state is the most important role and a central part of the social contract. So let me move to give you some examples about where areas I think the social contract is broken and what a better social contract could look like. And let's start with education. We've made huge progress in education. Countries like South Africa now have achieved universal primary education and are close to achieving universal secondary education. And the next slide will show you how countries tend to spend their money in the educational sector. Just wait a moment for that to come up. And what it shows is that the vast majority of countries spend most of their money on primary, secondary, and tertiary education. That's where the bulk of resources are. From when children are about the age of 5 or 6 to, let's say, 20. Spending on what's called pre-primary education, the little black bit at the top, at the end, and adult learning tends to be far less. But huge inequalities persist in all of our societies because of the forces of technology. And aging will mean that people will have to work much longer going forward and have to change jobs more often. And what we know from research from places as different as Jamaica and Chicago, the benefits of preschool education and supporting parenting skills early has huge impacts for people's life chances and also for the ability of young children to benefit from schooling. My favorite study is from Jamaica, which shows that children who were visited once a week by a community healthcare worker who helped parents make sure that the kids were well fed and that they had sufficient mental stimulation, those children who got that visit earned 42% more as adults than children who didn't benefit from that visit. And so that early years investment is one of the best ways to increase social mobility and deal with inequality in our societies. And so I would argue that a better educational system would invest more in those early years. Now let's go to the other end of the spectrum, adult learning. Oh, sorry, same slide, please. We know that people will have to work longer. We know that technology will change the skills that people will need. And yet most countries in the world underinvest terribly in adult learning. So I would argue that a better social contract would have an educational system that has a different shape, that isn't just focused on those years from age 6 to 20, but actually invested more in very young children and older people. That's one example. Let me turn to employment, and then we can turn to the next slide. One of the most striking things about modern labor markets is the informality, which certainly in my career we always used to associate with developing countries, has become a feature of work all around the world. And flexible contracts have become much, much more common, where workers don't work for many employers and don't get benefits of a stable contract associated with that. I think if we move to the next slide. Now, that flexibility in the labor market has had huge benefits for employers and consumers. Many employers benefit from that flexibility, and certainly as consumers, we've all benefited from lower costs as a result of it. But of course, the workers who are working on those flexible terms face huge insecurity and huge stress and uncertainty around how many hours they will work, what their income will be, and what happens to them when they get sick or old. I would argue that a better social contract would retain those benefits of flexibility for economic efficiency, but at the same time, provide workers with greater security in the form of mandatory benefits for all workers, regardless of their contract, and generous unemployment insurance if they lose their jobs, and retraining throughout life. This chart here shows you the way countries make very different choices. On the x-axis on the bottom is the degree of flexibility in the labor market, and on the y-axis on the left, it shows you the degree of protection or security that are provided to workers. And what you find is that many advanced economies are in the upper left-hand quadrant. You see countries like France and Germany and the Netherlands, where there is low flexibility in the labor market and high levels of social protection, which results in fairly rigid labor markets, often subject to high levels of unemployment. Many developing countries are in a almost worst of all possible worlds scenario. If you look in the lower left-hand quadrant, they have low flexibility and low levels of social protection. I think the sweet spot is in the upper right-hand quadrant, where you see countries like Denmark, Japan, and New Zealand. Because those are economies in which the labor market's very flexible, but at the same time, workers are provided with high levels of protection. In those economies, the social contract protects the worker rather than the job. If you look at many Nordic countries like Denmark, for example, they have very high rates of labor turnover, the highest in Europe. People lose their jobs all the time. But workers don't actually get notice periods or even severance pay. You might think that would be dreadful, but actually it's fine because they get very generous unemployment insurance that protects their income. They very immediately get put in retraining, and they tend to be very quickly reemployed. And so those countries have the highest level of employment of anywhere in the world. So a very different model, say, than what currently exists in South Africa. So I would argue that a better social contract would adopt this so-called flexicurity approach, which I should say is highly dependent on there being a collaborative relationship between employers, unions, and governments. And I think just as many countries have moved to allow workers' pensions to be portable, where if you move from one job to another, you can take your pension with you, I think we need to think about benefits more generally being portable. And so if you work for 3 employers in a week, each one of those employers has to contribute a bit to your sick leave insurance, to your unemployment insurance, to your pension, to your training needs. And so that we find a better way to balance flexibility and security. Finally, let me say a few words about the intergenerational social contract, where again, I think there are serious issues and we could do better. So every generation wants to leave the next generation better off, but I would argue we're at risk of leaving future generations with far fewer poorer prospects for their livelihoods, leaving them behind a legacy of debt, and of course, a severely damaged planet. The next slide, if we have a look at that, looks at whether people today in different countries think their children will be worse off or better off than they are. And what's really striking is that if you look at the bottom, most of the advanced economies, parents think their children will be worse off than them. In the developing world, it's different. In fact, in South Africa, it's just on the cusp of people believing that it's more likely their children will have a better life than them, which appears about a third of the way down. And of course, developing countries are still growing. There's lots of catch up that can be done. And it's probably true that young people will have a better life. But I would still argue that we are leaving the next generation with a legacy, both environmental and debt, and in terms of work, which puts their futures at risk, and that we could have a better intergenerational social contract. What would that look like? I think we need to invest much more in the education of young people to enable them to be productive over what will be much longer lives and much longer working lives. That would improve productivity, their productivity, and enable them to pay the taxes in the middle of their lives, which will take care of the elderly in terms of pensions and healthcare. It would also, in the end, raise growth and make debt more sustainable. I would love to see countries giving young people an educational endowment for life, a lump sum to which they are entitled to be able to invest in their learning as adults throughout their lives. And I think everyone should be given access to better reskilling opportunities, and our educational system needs to do a better job of delivering that. To achieve that and make it sustainable, I think today's older people may need to work longer. And I would link retirement ages, pension ages, to life expectancy explicitly. And so that as people grow older, they should expect to have to work a little bit longer before they're entitled to their pensions. And of course, we also need to look seriously at things like carbon taxation to change the equilibrium on climate change. And I think that set of intergenerational investments would be an enlightened generation in one generation in the next, but also have reciprocal benefits. So those are three examples: education, employment, and the intergenerational social contract, that show what a better contract could look like. Let me lay out some principles that I think can guide us as we think about what a better social contract would look like. First, I think the principle of minimum security for all needs to underpin it. There should be a floor below which no one's income should go. And in many countries, cash transfer programs have been introduced, including in South Africa, that provides small amounts of cash to the poorest households to maintain their living standards. And that minimum should also include access to basic healthcare and a minimum state pension to avoid destitution in old age. It should also include sick leave and unemployment insurance, regardless of the type of work that one does. In the developing world, that often means bringing more workers into the formal sector. And in advanced economies, it means paying that all employers should pay benefits to flexible workers. I should just say, as a caveat, and I'm sure we'll discuss this, I'm not a huge fan of universal basic income. I think it's either too small to matter, or if it's large, it's too burdensome in terms of the amount of tax you have to raise and the level of transfers you have to achieve. And I think in any country that's capable of targeting benefits, it should target that to the poorest households rather than do a universal basic income. But we can discuss that. So that's the first principle: minimum, some minimum below which no one should go. The second principle is maximum investment in opportunity and capability. I think in too many places, talent is wasted because opportunities are not provided to all. And of course, disaffection is greatest among those communities where the prospects of improving your life are poor or have fallen. The next slide, which will be my last slide, shows you how many generations it takes in different countries to go from the bottom of the income distribution to the middle. And what's striking are the differences. In the UK or the US, for example, it takes 5 generations to go from the bottom to the middle. In South Africa, sadly, it takes 9. In countries like Denmark, Finland, Norway, Sweden, the Nordics, who always do the best on these things, it takes 2 or 3 generations to achieve significant social mobility. Not surprisingly, where social mobility has been thwarted, political and social tensions are the highest. Now, maybe we can remove that slide and go back to the full screen. I would argue that much of that talent that we're losing because of low social mobility is embedded in women, minority groups, children who happen to be born into families or in places that are unable to give them opportunities. We know, for example, that in the United States, you can explain a huge amount of the productivity in the US economy over a 50-year period because suddenly employers didn't just draw on a narrow pool of white men, but actually drew on a much wider pool of women and Black people and minorities who were, because of civil rights legislation, increasingly brought into the labor market. Similarly, if today's lost Einsteins, women, minorities, children from poor families, who were enabled to invent to the same degree as children who were born into richer families, the rate of innovation in the economy could quadruple. So how do we better use the talent in our societies and bring those lost Einsteins into the economy? In addition to investing in the early years, which I described earlier, we also could give young people an entitlement to lifelong learning and education. And that would be a huge gain. And we could also do a much better job of helping women stay in the labor market. Even though we've equalized opportunities in education between boys and girls, women still do 2 more hours unpaid work around the world. And if we find better ways to provide childcare and a more equal distribution of labor in the household, we could get the benefit of all of those women who could stay in the labor market, more of whom actually go to university than men around the world today. So that's my second principle, big investment in opportunity and capability. My third principle would be to share risks better. I think too many risks in our society are currently being borne by individuals when they would be much more efficiently borne by others or by being managed collectively. For example, it's possible to maintain flexibility for employers in being able to hire and fire workers depending on market conditions if those workers know that they will receive unemployment insurance and retraining that will provide them with security until they find a job. Having individuals carry that risk is really inefficient. And having employers carry all of the risk without any flexibility is also inefficient. I think there's a similar rebalancing of risks that can occur around childcare, around health, around old age. For example, it's not clear why the costs of maternity leave are usually borne by employers, when paid parental leave through general taxation would create a more level playing field in the labor market between men and women. Similarly, many health risks are much more efficiently managed by pooling them across a large population and providing incentives for individuals to manage the risks around things like diet and exercise. Another reform is automatic enrollment in pension schemes and insurance for old age. And if people are by default automatically enrolled, you get much more take-up and much more security in old age. Some countries, for example, Japan and Germany, require people to have social care insurance as they get older, so that if they can't look after themselves when they're old, there is insurance to pay for that care. So now that I've described some of the elements of what I think a better social contract would look like, let me talk a little bit about the politics, which I'm sure will come up in the conversation. So if you look around the world and see which countries have better social contracts, they tend to occur in countries that have more inclusive political systems, where there are strong accountability mechanisms like free and fair elections, a free media. But you can also have a good social contract in countries like China, where you have a very strong selectorate in the Communist Party that enforces accountability. Countries that have more presidential, winner-takes-all political systems tend to have smaller states and less generous social contracts. Countries that have proportional representation tend to provide more support for their citizens because they need to form broad coalitions to govern. And in those broad coalitions for political consensus, you get more social cohesion and more generous social contracts. Authoritarian regimes that have little accountability face few pressures to deliver on social contracts, and we see that around the world. How do you organize the politics for a better social contract? So One thing I'd say from having been a policymaker is that sometimes making the problem bigger makes it easier to solve, because you can trade off costs and benefits and build coalitions for change. So for an example, if I'm an employee in my late 50s looking forward to retirement, I might be willing to work a little bit longer if I know that my children will get an educational endowment for their lives. Similarly, a young person might be willing to accept to pay more tax if they feel that society has invested generously in their education and will continue to support them in their skills. I also think that the pandemic will change politics. We see already in many countries that the pandemic has a huge impact on people's expectations about insurance, the social solidarity, healthcare. And I think the political discourse over the coming years will be shaped by that experience. I also think that social contracts have often been reshaped at times of crisis, when windows of political opportunity open up and you're able to get significant reforms through. And I think many countries will be facing such times of crisis in the years ahead. Let me just say a couple of words about affordability. Can countries afford a more generous social contract? I would argue yes. There are some elements of what I've described that would require more public spending, increasing publicly supported childcare or early years education or lifelong learning, as would achieving universal health care and minimum state pension. Some of the spending is investment, like education. You know, on average around the world, the rate of return on education, public spending on education, is about 10%. That's very high, and it would generate net benefits if we measured them properly. And those investments could sensibly be financed through borrowing. Some of the things I've described would also contribute to productivity and growth, and that too would generate future tax revenues in the future. I think we do have to look at some additional taxation in some areas. A carbon tax, I think, would make enormous sense, and we can discuss that. I think we also need to look at wealth taxes. Now, there are three ways you can tax wealth: inheritance, taxes on dividends and capital gains, or you can try and tax the stock of wealth. Many countries tax inheritance. Many countries tax dividends and capital gains. The stock of wealth is the hardest, but it's also the most powerful, because that's where we've seen the greatest inequality in recent years. I think a very good proxy is property. And I know this is it's a very controversial issue, but 2/3 of global wealth is held in the form of property, land and property and real estate. And in the vast majority of countries, property taxes are very low and it's undertaxed. And so I do think we need to look at better property taxation and taxation of carbon to help support a better social contract. But the most important thing I'd say is that what I am not talking about is a kind of Robin Hood solution of taxing the rich to give more money to the poor to fund a new social contract. I'm talking about something much more fundamental than that. What I'm talking about is fundamentally changing and equalizing the distribution of opportunities in a society. And that's far more powerful than anything the state can do through redistribution retroactively. This is what economists often call pre-distribution policies, policies such as equalizing access to good education or providing additional investment in deprived communities. And that's far more empowering than the alternative of redistribution. In fact, I would argue that if the state has to do a lot of redistribution, then the social contract has failed, because what you want is for people to get better outcomes through the labor market rather than having to rely on redistribution. So just to conclude, I think a new social contract is not about higher taxes, more redistribution, and a bigger welfare state. It's about reordering and equalizing the distribution of opportunities and security in our society. I think the result will be higher productivity, a more efficient sharing of risks around childcare, health, work, and old age that is a source of so much anxiety in many countries. I think financing it requires a rebalancing of, say, the relative taxation of capital and labor. and investing much more in education and greening the economy. In the end, I think we owe each other more than our current social contracts can deliver. A bit less emphasis on me, a bit more emphasis on we, and a new social contract is possible that draws on everyone's talents, that invests in everyone, but also asks everyone to contribute more to the common good for the future. I'll stop there and return it back to Busani.
And thank you very much for that intervention. Is very important and grounded on what is happening in South Africa today. Let me request the panelists, in fact, they are here, they are not robots. Let me request them to turn on their videos. The former Statistician General, Palele Hotla, Professor Madoda Figeni, Dr. Tabi Leyoka. Are you all in? There they are. These are our respondents today. We will start with Dr. Palele Hotla, former Statistician General, one of the longest serving Directors General in post-apartheid South Africa. We will give him 5 to 10 minutes. After that, we will go to Leyoka, then we will go to Fikeni in that order. Thank you. Over to you, SG.
Busani, thank you very much, Dr. Busani, and my fellow panelists, and thank you very much to the Baroness for a very enlightening, provocative presentation. And I want to take from where you ended, looking at what Amartya Sen says, that human lives are battered and diminished in all kinds of ways. And the first is to acknowledge that deprivations of very different kinds have to be accommodated within a general overarching framework, which I think provides for we owe each other or one another a lot more. And the purpose of my presentation, and I am a research associate at Oxford. I work with Dr. Sabina Alkir on multidimensional poverty. In building this, we've actually brought awareness in the implementation only of this multidimensional poverty, not only for society in terms of people who are poor, but to conscientize business into multidimensionality and how it should participate. That's how I would like to foreground the discussion, that what are the instruments that are available and what is the situation in South Africa. I'm trying to move my slides, but they are refusing to move. I do not know why, but let's see. The slides are disappointing me. Well, let me just escape. My system has frozen. Let me go to next year. Okay. In dealing with this, what we realize is that there is a framework of production, which is the portrait of that goes through increasing income per capita, but as the labor productivity, the absorption rate in terms of trade. But each one of these don't occur well in South Africa, because either the labor productivity is low, absorption rate in terms of unemployment is very high, and the terms of trade are very much unfavorable to South Africa. So looking at South Africa, we are in a bit of a difficult, space as South Africa. And in this difficult space, I don't know why my laptop, and of course, this difficult space is preceded by the movement of Fees Must Fall, where I thought, in terms of your arguments, Baroness, that South Africa lost an opportunity to look at what were the main ingredients of the Fees Must Fall movement and what it brought to us as society. One would have imagined that as government would have taken advantage of the Fees Must Fall movement, because these people carry a lot in themselves to advance future benefits to society. But we lost all that. We started by nitpicking and saying who are the poor and who are the rich, and who we should pay for, the poor or the rich. And in so doing, we divided society further instead of taking advantage of where they were. My system here is really disappointing me in terms of moving forward. And here, what one can listen to Nelson Mandela.
And there is no sound. You have to share sound, go on top and share sound.
Oh, is that so? Is it coming through?
No, there is no sound, yeah.
Oh.
So we have to share sound on your computer sound.
Okay. Yeah. Well, I'll say what you said.
Okay.
Nelson Mandela here was talking about, okay, we can go to share sound here. Thanks, Principal.
To enable you to grasp sophisticated concepts fully.
Is the sound coming through?
And the environment between the school and the home was totally different. You come to parents, some of whom have never seen the inside of a school.
I think I will start again.
What is the position with the blacks in this country, with Africans, coloreds, and Indians? In most cases, they were excluded from schools. To say even less of tertiary education, because you did not have the facilities. You could not go to the best schools in the country, which are well equipped to enable you to grasp sophisticated concepts fully. And the environment between the school and the home was totally different. You come to parents, some of whom have never seen the inside of a school.
This is Nelson Mandela.
What is the position?
This is our type of investment in education in South Africa. It's not very pleasing. And you can see this in the results in terms of succession or progression from primary to high school. This is primary, this is middle school, and this is those who complete matric. You can see the blacks are dragging behind because education is not well funded. And in terms of the demographic dividend, here we are looking at blacks and whites, whites this side and blacks this side. And you can see the proportion of those that progress to higher education is very low amongst blacks. In fact, if you look at absolute numbers, the number of people with higher education is very, very low to sustain South Africa's growth. In terms of priorities, society in South Africa prioritizes education as number 15. So in terms of the challenges that we have, we are in a worse situation like prisoners in the death row. In terms of benefits of employment, if you look at quarter 4, 2021 and quarter 1 or 20, in 2008, this was the number of young people that were employed. By 2021, this is the number. So they've lost in absolute numbers in terms of employment. So the youth are actually losing. The mother cat is eating the chickens or the kittens. And in terms of their kinds of challenges that they face, is that poverty is much more pronounced where educational attainment is low, where adult employment doesn't exist, and when you are not in school and in education. So that explains almost 63% of the situation. Coming to your graphs, what we see, and I want to just go onto this slide, which shows what happens to higher education. You can see what happens to higher education amongst blacks. The retention rate is dropping for a cohort that starts. Not many of them will complete compared to what whites have and Indians have. And while the gradient in the 80s was the same as that of whites and Indians, in the latter period, actually there are serious losses. And when you look at your graph here, investment in education at the early age in South Africa actually is deplorable, because we are losing people that are in education and they can't even come into the working age here where they pay taxes. So they remain dependent on the state. And of course, as we look at South Africa here, in terms of how hopeful we are for the future generation, it actually suggests that based on the numbers that we have, that hope might just be false until and unless we do something very drastic. And your presentation is too telling in terms of what we may look at as the benefits of education from a demographic dividend point of view, where the whites in South Africa are like Korea and the blacks are this that surely will impact severely on the futures of South Africa. The hope, I would argue, is etched, not so much in the reality. I think the reality is somewhere else. And I think your contribution is a wake-up call for us to think very differently as to how we fund education and not nitpick. Because in part, the universities where you have a good proportion of blacks, whites, Indians, and coloreds, and that's where we can actually form coalitions that are more strategic. And by actually, the price might be pay for everybody in order to invest in the future, rather than nitpick and say we'll pay for the poorest of all and leave the rich. Because by doing so, you divide the student body and you actually divide the aspirations of the nation. I leave it there, and thank you very much for your presence. Or rather, what I think needs to be done, therefore, is really to look at multidimensionality in order to minimize the conflict that is between labor and profit, capital, that minimizes government and capital conflicts, that minimizes popular support and the societal utility of services, and the conflict between capital and society. And through this multidimensional lens that we have at Oxford, both in terms of general society and business, seems to be gaining momentum, particularly in business, where banks like Citi are actually exploring how social bonds may actually deliver better results, so social-wide results. And I leave it there, Chair.
Hey, thank you, SG. Now let's move over to Dr. Tabi Leoka. You've made some very strong arguments recently about spending. In a sense, you're making arguments that have been made by one of the government leaders who said there is no country that can spend its way out of a recession, and we've engaged with that debate, including the debate on whether or not we are a failed state, and what happened, how do societies become failed states, especially in the absence of compacts, which is the main theme for today. Over to you, Dr. Leoka.
Thank you. Thank you to the Baroness for a very, very provocative, but also very interesting presentation. I couldn't agree more with everything that you've said. I think, a country like South Africa, we're faced with a lot of challenges. And right now, I think that speaking to the average South African, I've never heard South Africans being so negative and so unclear and uncertain about the future of the country. So something like a social contract is really needed, but at the same time, we're more divided now, in my opinion, than I've seen South Africans. Part of it is that South Africans feel like they've been let down by their own leaders. When South Africans have said, look, this is where we're willing, let's meet halfway. And government has said, okay, this is what we'll do on our part, and then government doesn't provide. So currently we have an electricity crisis, for instance, and this is an ongoing problem that has started, I think, in 2007. And the government had promised us 3 new power stations in Ngula, Medupi, and Kusile. And as we speak, I think last week, the Eskom announced that only one, which is the smallest one, which is Ngula, which is a hydro power station, if I'm not mistaken, that is finally coming on board since 2007. But the other two are still in construction. There's still problems, etc. So what that has done is that it has led to a lack of electricity supply, a reliable electricity supply, and that has impacted on many South Africans' ability to do work, to get employed, for the economy to grow, for the economy to absorb labor. So again, this is a promise that was made, a commitment that was made, but not fulfilled. And we have daily power shortages and also daily load shedding, which is basically cutting off electricity for a few hours so that the electricity supply can be balanced throughout the country. The other one is, health. And I think you asked which part, is it the state or is it household that should be providing for, health care? And in our instance, again, a commitment was made that we'll have public health care. And we've had public health care, even, from apartheid South Africa all the way through to now, but it has deteriorated. And part of it is that it has been impacted by the lack of sufficient electricity supply. But at the same time, we're seeing doctors leaving South Africa, going elsewhere. We're seeing nurses going elsewhere as well. We're not seeing the appointment of new nurses. We have, we currently need about over 20,000 nurses a year. We're only receiving about 3,000, and yet we're talking about, we often talk about this, unemployment rate and the need to employ more people, and yet we have these problems within our country. Education, again, promised great education so that we can be absorbed into the labor market, and our education is subpar. I think you talked about percentages, in your affordability discussion, you talked about that education. I think you said in your graph was about 10% of expenditure, or most countries spend about 10%. We spend about 20% of our expenditure on education, but the outcomes of our education is, doesn't reflect on the amount that we've allocated to education. And again, if you look at rural education or rural schools and urban schools, there's a huge distinction, and this also causes, a rift, and we're seeing this unemployment rate widen, so inequality rate widen as a result of different areas and urban schools getting more resources than rural schools. Again, putting people in rural areas in poverty. You mentioned, the wealth tax. We do we do have dividend tax. The problem with South African entry and the whole discussion about a wealth tax is that about 15 million South Africans are employed, and 35% of South Africans are unemployed, working population. And so of those 15 million South Africans that are employed, about 7 million contribute meaningfully towards taxes. So basically, the tax contribution, especially the personal income tax, which is often deducted from those who are employed, the contributors tend to be people in the wealthier classes. So now, if you then put further, taxes on the wealthy, you will then shrink the contribution of taxes towards revenues. So it is a sensitive issue, and I think I like the property tax in property, but because of the composition of this country, it will be very difficult to then introduce, other types of wealth taxes to then put pressure on the very people that are contributing towards taxes. So, I also agree with you. I'm not a fan of a universal basic income grant. And there has been a huge discussion, very contentious discussion. And I think that's what also Busani alluded to in introducing me. And so there's been a big discussion in South Africa about supporting the poor and through grants. And during our budget this year, at the beginning of the year, in February, the minister mentioned that a significant portion, about 46% of South Africans, are recipients of some type of grant. Now, that is not a number to confidently mention, because in an ideal society, we shouldn't, those people, especially those in the working population, should actually be productive, self-sufficient, contributing towards growing this economy. And again, I think that the state has failed them, for them to then having to resort to then a social grant, a grant from the state. What has happened is that, so most of the grant recipients, the recent grant recipients, are an impact of COVID. But there is this mismatch between who should be providing the jobs and who should also be providing ensuring that the environment is conducive for businesses to thrive and employ. And that is also one of the fixtures in terms of the responsibility of government and responsibility of, let's say, the private sector to ensure that people are employed. And government has said, look, we are going to provide, we're going to create 1 million jobs, for instance. And then the president at the State of the Nation address says, no, actually, it is not the role of the government to provide jobs. It's the role of the private sector. And the private sector then says, no, it's not actually, well, we can provide jobs, we can employ people, but firstly, we need, skilled labor, which we don't have, and therefore we need to go elsewhere to get the skilled labor. So there's a failure in the education system. And secondly, the environment is not conducive for us to grow and employ more people. And there's, regulatory hurdles, there's all sorts of hurdles that are in the way for governments, for the private sector to thrive. And so the people who are left in the middle, or the victims and those who are left vulnerable, are South Africans, who again are in the middle of who's responsible and how do we get out of this predicament of ours. We want jobs. We're owed good education, we're owed good health services, we're owed all of this to ensure that we get employed, we ensure that we are in good health to get employed. And yet, between, let's say, the government is not providing that, and then those who are supposed to be employing you are not employing you because you don't match the skills that you're supposed to have. So there's a lot of, the two between private sector and government and public sector need to come together. And there needs to be a solid social compact that everyone agrees to and that everyone adheres to in this country. And this me culture of, we need it, I'm a leftist, or I'm a right, or I'm a this, or I'm a, my creed, my race, whatever, needs to stop. And we need to agree on where we want to see the future of the country, and the participants need to be identified. For instance, we need to make sure that when we grow sustainably, and we don't leave people behind. And we need to make sure that when we grow as an economy, we need to grow in an equitable environment, and we need to grow in a sustainable and equitable way. And I mean that in the broader sense, in terms of also our environment, our society, that needs to be considered again in terms of how we move forward. That, for me, has not been clear, and it is a huge point of contention right now in terms of where we are, where we see ourselves in the future, and who are the role players and who's responsible for ensuring that growth is sustainable and also equitable. I'll leave it on that note. Thank you.
Thank you, Tabi, for that intervention. Let's go to Prof. Sumadoda Fikeni.
Thank you very much, Program Director, Professor Ncaweni, and also I commend you for organizing what seemingly is beginning to be the center focus of shaping public discourse, and also very illuminating presentation by Baroness Shafiq on a topical issue that the country is grappling with. When such sharp minds have already spoken, you are taser, because the key nuggets have been raised. But let me try to raise a few things. The first one, I like crisis period. All minds are collected to deal with the issue of creating space for consensus building dialogue, which leads to a social compact. And that is the space where we are as a country in South Africa. But I want to highlight something as a political scientist. The negotiated settlement of the early 90s was more like your Latin American elite transition coalition, where the elites from both sides were having a stalemate with the liberation movement too strong to lose but too weak to win outright. Same with the other side. Now that elite social compact, but what is now needed is your socio. But because the elite itself has concentrated itself into a space of assimilation where the inequalities have risen, but mainly with the existing legacy classes and the assimilated political class. Then where should this motivation for a social compact come from? Political class and the business class. Will it come from outside? One would be asking. There's so much fragmentation now, and as such that the trade union movement is not in the leadership of government increasingly, and testing of the intentions of government and the ruling party, as well as the labor movement. They all are in polarized positions where trade-offs find themselves very difficult to be. But I want to also raise the issue of education, which you raised, Baroness, quite sharply, and very important issues that you have actually raised around education. But saying in South for the lack of investment in education, perhaps it is the quality of education and where the money is spent, because we keep throwing more money into problems, but the returns seem to be diminishing. So that to me becomes the key issue. Quality of education also in a sense of training those who are produced by that system to manage some degree of self-reliance where employment may not be found, some entrepreneurship, some social entrepreneurship, and so forth. That seemed to be lacking as a discourse. Each time it's let's add more budget, but we never ask why we're spending more, but the returns are so low. The next issue that you mentioned, Baroness, that I don't think it's given enough attention is the issue of the social security that families complementing all other structures used to provide. And in South Africa, particularly within the majority African Blacks and the colored communities, there are different studies showing that the family structure has collapsed. And now there seems to be absolute total dependence on the social security and the social grants of the state. How do we deal with that particular issue, which is the family that we do not normally speak to most of the time? And the other issue that we have not spoken to, and yet it's in the midst of countries, you also have the issue of migration pressures, economic refugees contesting the space because of the challenges in their various regions. And these have created populist movements, have created presidents like Trump and so forth. And elsewhere in Europe, it's leading to even reviews of some of the policies that they had, which were quite progressive in a way. In South Africa, we're beginning to see similar tensions and pressures. How do we factor that one in within the notion of searching for social compact? Then the other issue that I think is very important to raise, where corruption has become so rampant, so pervasive, so deep to a point where you may say you have a patrimonial system. What chances for the oxygen of social compact to breathe when the carbon monoxide of corruption is everywhere? Because I'm sure even efforts to craft such a, if some of those fingered and those who are seen as being part of these patronage systems are in the lead. So that in itself, I think it's something worth mentioning. Towards the end, I want to raise the major trends which are driving global system towards what I believe could be a new world order. As Baroness was saying, the pandemic will change politics. And I'm saying pandemic combined with climate change it's on just transition and so forth, the fourth industrial revolution and so on, are beginning to change the world, but globally and locally to shape instead of the negative. And as in place, it looks like strong vision, but in our case, we have serious leadership crisis, not just politically, but also in the labor unions, in the business sector, in the civil society. Capable state institutions are also another undergirding factor, but here we seem to have a problem with that also. And also the quality and the capacity of people participating in these spaces, and weaknesses which became more evident. The participation on a broad sense seem to have been diminished, generally weakened, except for a few, which are around very few people and the minorities. Now, the last point I want to raise, how do we balance social security that fosters dependency and entitlement with the kind of social security and capacity building that fosters self-reliance and build genuinely sustainable capacity amongst people, which are more redemptive? Shortcut is usually to say, give the basic income grant. And then you avoid the deep structural issues that you have to deal with. It was interesting when you said 2/3 of world's wealth is in form of property. And in our case, the levels of inequality itself in terms of the property ownership and the shrinking middle class, especially of the majority, which is often once salary away from poverty for social combat. I thank you.
Thank you very much for that intervention, Prof. Now, Baroness, you heard the South African perspective. There's an interesting interplay between their interventions and the main inputs that you made earlier on. Of course, I'm sure they will be getting the book and they're going through the book as well, so they understand your thesis in detail, but we'll be keen now to hear your response to what they have said. And you might have checked as well on the chat platform, there's a few questions that are there. So let me hand over to you to react to them and some of the questions that are on the Q&A platform.
Okay, thank you very much. Those were really terrific comments, and you raised so many issues, not all of which I'll be able to answer, but I'd love to have a discussion with you about them. So one big theme was around jobs and where the jobs are going to come from, and given the incredibly high rate of unemployment in South Africa and what the policy response was. And I think, Tabi mentioned, I don't think government can create 1 million jobs in South Africa, but those jobs will be created by the private sector. But the question is, what is government doing to support the private sector to do that? And clearly a situation in which reliable electricity is not available and energy is so unreliable is not a great environment for private investment. And sort of fixing those kind of core infrastructure areas is a precondition for the kind of levels of investment one will need to see to create more jobs. And so, I think for me, the division of labor is pretty clear. Governments need to provide the infrastructure and the educated workforce, and then the private sector will create the jobs. I guess the other area I would look at is, I know the labor market in South Africa is not like what I've just described in terms of flex security. It's a two-tier labor market where you have a formal sector with highly regulated and then a very big informal sector, which is unregulated. And, I'm very aware of the history of how we got here, and many, many countries have that kind of dual labor market structure. But in the end, you end up reducing job creation for all of those people who are in the informal sector or unemployed. And the politics of this are very, very difficult. But I think if it's possible to transition to a labor market where there is more flexibility around hiring, firing, severance, but much more generosity on unemployment insurance and skills, my guess would be that you would see much higher levels of employment with that sort of structure, and that the current structure disincentivizes job creation from the private sector. So I would point in that direction for solutions. You all talked about education, and that investment in education is high, but the returns are poor. And a lot of this is around how teachers are incentivized, and whether they are incentivized to deliver better outcomes for students. I'm not comfortable with it. In the UK, there's a very strong focus on targets, which sometimes distorts the incentives that teachers face. But I do think one has to look very critically at what determines how well teachers are paid and whether they're seen as successful, and are we providing the right incentives. I also quite agree. I think Professor Somadodo said at the end that there's room for social innovation around education, and particularly, we all saw the perils of the pandemic and what that did to losses of educational opportunities for many, many children. On the other hand, we all learned that we could do a lot more digitally than we ever thought possible. And I do think that the combination of digital and social entrepreneurship around educational outcomes has huge potential for changing the way we think about the educational system, certainly at the adult level, but also at the secondary level. So I think those would be my main reactions to the comments. But would you like me to also discuss some of the things in the Q&A,
Yes.
or would you? Yes.
Yes.
Okay. So let me. It's a lot of questions in the Q&A. So let me. So the question, I think the first question is really around: do we focus on early years, or do we focus on young adults as the problem? The thing about early years investments is they're very long term, but they have very high returns. So the investments in early years will not show up in terms of productivity, tax receipts, higher incomes for 20 years. But having said that, the rates of return are phenomenally high. So I think we can't not invest in those early years. The question about what to do with young adults, some of whom probably didn't get very good educations and are therefore unemployed, is very difficult. I don't always think the answer is sending them to university. And I think there are a handful of countries in the world that are really good at looking at alternative paths to tertiary education, whether it's vocational training, technical training, apprenticeships, and so on. But I think that's an area where, just as an example, government subsidies to private sector to encourage apprenticeships can be quite effective. Also, training programs. I remember seeing a training program in Nepal where the government funded the training. Let's just say, I'm going to throw out a number. Let's say it cost 1,500 for this training program. The government paid 500 when the students were enrolled, 500 when they graduate, and then the rest only when they had been in the job for over a year. And so providing strong incentives for training and skills providers to actually place people in work and keep them in work for a long time. Similarly, subsidies to apprenticeships, so that, for example, government pays the wages of an apprentice for the first 6 months and then phases it over to the employer. But things like that get young adults into the workplace so that they can learn on the job rather than trying to rely on the university system to deal with that problem, I think is a far more effective approach. Let me just take maybe one more from the chat. So one person is asking around skills and technology and whether we should tax technology. I guess I wouldn't tax technology as a way to deal with unemployment. There is a debate about whether our current system of taxes is favors capital over labor. And so I think that's how I would think about it. And I don't know the tax system sufficiently well in South Africa, but in many countries, labor is taxed quite a lot because much of the benefits are taxed on labor. So things like unemployment insurance, pensions, and so on are a tax on labor, which makes labor very expensive for employers. Whereas capital is often subsidized through tax incentives for capital and so on. And I think that is a legitimate question about, have we got that balance right? And does the tax system actually discourage employers from creating jobs? And I do think it's legitimate to re-look at that balance. So, for example, should some of the benefits that are currently funded through employment taxation, would it be better if they were funded through general taxation, like VAT or income tax, for example? Does it make sense that, sick leave and parental leave and pensions and unemployment insurance are funded as a tax on labor? And I think if you look at that, you could actually do quite a lot to level the playing field between capital and labor and result in technology choices that would actually increase employment. So maybe I'll just pause there and see if any of the commentators wanted to come back, and then I can maybe take a few more of the questions in the Q&A.
Okay, thank you. Let me request the Minister Pravin Gordhan to make an intervention, Minister for Public Enterprises. Minister.
Wonderful, it'd be lovely. And thank you, Pravin, for suggesting this, this occasion. It was really a wonderful opportunity for me.
Good morning, Minush, and it's good to see you. And thanks to Busani for making sure that this event takes place. And I think your contribution, once we get some time to reflect on it, is going to be quite important for us, given where we are, but indeed, as you and others have pointed out, where the world is as well. And I think the key issue that is emerging is this is a time, on the one hand, to deal with the immediate crises, if you like, that we have before us. But on the other hand, it's also a time to step back, review and rethink how societies go forward, and take into account, as you pointed out, the impact of the pandemic, the impact of authoritarian regimes, the failure of current economic models to provide for all in society. As Professor Fikeni Samadora pointed out, the impact of corruption, not just in South Africa, but across the world. And we've had our own brand of it in quite a severe form that some of us seem to forget in terms of the kind of impact that it has had on our institutions. And again, that's a point that the professor and yourself mentioned, which is the importance of institutions, but the institutions that also can imbibe new ways of doing things rather than become calcified. And that's part of the challenge that I think all of us in different countries face. And we have our own challenge as a young democracy as well. So I think your book and your presentation demands that each of us look at our own societies and ask the question, not what is wrong with it and what doesn't work and who do we blame for what fault we have, but rather use this as an opportunity to think about where do we go from here? And how do we create some positivity and hope, not hopelessness, in our current environment? And how do new concepts, new ideas, new experiences, and new thoughts, both from within South Africa and elsewhere, create essentially a new paradigm within which to ask the question, where to from here, South Africa? Our first social contract or political contract, if you like, was in the early 1990s. Yeah. Started in 1989 in jail when Mr. Mandela did what he did and Mr. de Klerk then did what he did. And that remains a powerful legacy for South Africa, and one which many people across the world admire and draw lessons from. In your own context, Northern Ireland had both Mr. Ramaphosa and Mr. Mayor as key people who contributed to the final deal and the setting aside of the arms, if people would recollect that particular moment. And so that achievement of our own country through our own efforts is something that we need to give some recognition to. So indeed, we have many problems, and some of the commentators have mentioned them, but that's not the issue for today. I think the issue for today is how do we seize the opportunities that we have, but also how do we address in a different way issues like family structure, as has been mentioned, issues like better outcomes from our education system. I think we didn't mention the health system today, which is equally important. You do mention it in your book, where because of corruption and mismanagement, ordinary citizens suffer every single day in our public hospitals. and something different needs to be done. Yes, the government must play a role, but we're also living at a time when ordinary citizens must be organized, they must be mobilized, they must be activated, and they must make an impact on poor services, on poorly run institutions, and politicians who don't do their work, where that is actually required as well. So I'm not exempting people like ourselves from that kind of pressure, because that's the essence of democratic accountability in some ways. So in some, the key questions are, how do we, in the current context, using the concept of social contract or social compact, how do we still have or bring together leaders who have faith in this country, who have hope in this country, so that they can create a unity of purpose and around a set of issues like corruption, like reconstituting or rebuilding the education system, and more importantly, creating an economic path that is far more inclusive than it is today, not limited to the elites, as was mentioned earlier on, and one which benefits all of the population as opposed to a select few, whether the select few come from the past or the select few are a post-1994 select few. And in that sense, that unity of purpose must result in a new and urgent effort to rebuild our institutions, but also rethink and implement in a new way these sorts of programs that begin to make a difference. So thank you for the agitation that you offer. I think in South Africa, Busani, we need to now start directing our energies and our intellectual and other capabilities to addressing the question, what do we do about these issues rather than complain about them? But secondly, how can each one of us use our resources in a way in which we begin to make a difference to the lives of ordinary people at the end of the day? So thank you very much for this opportunity to say a few words. And thanks, Vinush, for coming on.
Well, thank you, Pravin. I couldn't have said it better myself. I'm grateful for your wonderful synthesis, and you're absolutely right. I mean, the reason I wrote the book was to provide solutions, because I was tired of what I call admiring the problem. I think we've been admiring the problem for too long. We need to, in each of these areas, there are ways forward. And I think thinking about it as a social compact is a really helpful way for finding good solutions. And I very much hope to see South Africa achieve them, since you are a very special country to everyone in the world, and everyone wants to see you succeed.
Thank you. Now, I'm going to request the Deputy Chairperson of the National Planning Commission. I'll give him 2 minutes, the Deputy Chair of the National Planning Commission, Professor Maseremule. He will 2 to 3 minutes talk about the role of the public service, after which I will request the panelists to round up for 2 minutes, and then Dr. Shafiq will then do a closing. So Prof. Maseremule, followed by the panelists in the order in which they presented for 2 minutes, and then we will round up and close. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Principal. Am I audible?
Yes, yes, we can hear you.
Thank you so much. And great intervention, Baroness. We greatly appreciate that you could actually put aside your time to come and engage us as South Africans on various issues that are actually confronting us. And thank you so much, the discussants, including the Minister. Let me start from where the Minister ended. What do we do from here? I think that's a very important question, and we need to answer it conscientiously. I've always been having a bit of a challenge, and I always ask myself, so many questions. And obviously, because I am in an education sector, I may be biased in terms of the type of questions that often preoccupy my mind. But those questions also, despite the fact that I ask them from the perspective of the higher education sector, they are so critically important, particularly as it relates to the developmental challenges that are confronting the country. Because for any development to be sustainable, we need to have good quality education. And often, Minister, I ask myself the question that, but when the new dispensation took over, why did we not take a conscious decision that we identify one preferably historically Black university and turn it into a model of Black excellence in terms of producing the quality graduates that we want, pump in resources, get the best that we can, that we could actually get from the world, bring them to South Africa, enter into a contract with them to say that this is what we expect from you in terms of imparting your skills. Because I am saying what I'm saying, colleagues, because from where I'm seated, for us to achieve sustainable development, we need to start where it matters most, our education system, the quality of our education. And of course, also, as you indicated, the principal, the role of the public service is key in any developmental state. So the question that we need to ask ourselves is, what is the state of our public service? And perhaps I'm asking a rhetorical question, because in many instances, we answered that question. And in many instances, yes, there are pockets of excellence elsewhere, but also there are still fundamental challenges as well. And we answered that question in many ways. The professionalization framework, which is underway, is a very important intervention, and many other interventions that the Public Service Commission from Professor Figene context, and also Department of Public Service and Administration, so forth and so on. But the question is, are we making the progress that we are supposed to make? And this question also is consistently emerge, particularly if you are to take into account the recent presentation that was made by the Director General of Treasury about our state of local government. If you analyze the main sources of all these challenges that we are confronted with, they've got to do with the quality of the human capital that we have as a country. And it goes back to the role that as a university, as post-school education, or as education in general, we are playing in terms of making sure that we give the country good quality human capital. So my intervention largely, principle, is around the question of education and development, because for me, education is key if we are to talk about quality public service. And quality public service is a function of quality education and many other issues that we could actually talk about. Perhaps as I just come to the conclusion of my quick intervention, we are all lamenting about corruption, and still also insofar as corruption is concerned, we need to also go back and try to ask ourselves a fundamental question about the extent to which our education system can assist us in creating an ethical society. I often used to say when I interact in conversation of this nature that somehow we seem to, as we engage with issues of educating our kids, somehow we seem to only put emphasis on one aspect that relates to the purpose of education, of course, which is to develop the cognitive faculty of our students. But what is key also is to what extent is our education system contributing towards creating, in contributing towards forming a character. In other words, what is the role of an education system in the character formation of our students and also of society in general? So these are some of the fundamental questions that often come to mind when one thinks about the challenges that are confronting this country. But what is key is that we should continuously keep on saying that, what do we do? You know, and that is the question which I think the minister underscored. But I am greatly grateful that when I listened to the presentations which were made by the panelists and also by our guests, they tend to also offer some solution. And that is what we need to begin to focus on. We have problems. Let's talk about them, but let's spend more time in terms of thinking about the solution. Thank you very much, colleagues, and thank you very much, Principal.
Thank you. SG, 2 minutes round up from you, then we go to Tabi and Figeni.
Yes, thank you, Chair. I mean, the title is what do we owe each other, one another? I think that's the key message from the book. And I think in defining that, we actually have to focus on what the compact should deliver. Discuss the components of what the compact should deliver. I think the issue of a social compact and its need, that it is a necessary thing to do, to undertake, are resolved. It needs to be. What we need is to discuss what should it deliver. And I think that's the tough question given our level of polarization. But we have a perfect moment now, like pre-1994, when people were in discussion. South Africa is actually in serious conversation, but from a point of discomfort, of feeling hopelessness, because we have been betrayed. I think that's the general feeling. But we can't dwell on the betrayal. We actually have to rise, and that has to say, what should you deliver? And I think multidimensionality across business and societal needs becomes the core, as Amartya Sen says. We suffer multiple deprivations, and these deprivations are coming to the fore. Finally, I must say, on the children in South Africa, 60% of fathers say they are married against 30% of mothers. There is a serious problem at birth that actually disqualifies children from a proper life. We need to bring dignity to children and women. And it starts at the creation of life. We need to solve that. Short of doing so and not looking at the data, may create even more problems. So thank you very much, Baroness. Thank you very much, Principal of the school. Thanks.
Abby?
Thank you. Very interesting discussions and also questions which the Baroness has answered. Some of them, most of them deal with education. This is one statistics that always, surprises me, that 100 students start school, and only 6 of those 100 finish university in 4 years. And so there's obviously something wrong with our education system and the outcomes of our education system. I totally, agree with what the minister has said and also the SG in terms of hope. But it's very difficult to have hope when you have an empty stomach, and when you've been constantly betrayed, overpromised, under delivery. And so I sympathize with the people of South Africa who are feeling really betrayed and hopeless currently. I do think that the responsibility does sit with government. We vote government for a reason, and and so they need to deliver as well and on their promises. And I also think that we shouldn't just walk away from some of their issues. We need to sit down, talk about the problems, the cause of our problems, in order for us to move forward. So I am hearing a sense of, okay, let's start afresh and go back to like pre-1994. Yes, but at the same time, I think that we are a different generation. We're no longer the pre-94 generation. I'm looking at, my future, and I want everybody who participated in the demise of South Africa to go to jail if they have been involved in corruption, and then those who are in positions of power who are not delivering, they should leave. And so that is the only way that would give me a sense of hope, and also give me energy to then want to contribute again to the country. That's, I will give, but only to a certain extent, and I can only take the betrayal to a certain extent. So if we are to move forward, I think we need to be very honest about what has happened, and also honest about what we want the future to hold, and also include the young people in discussions like this, because the future is theirs, frankly, and they need to decide on how the future should look like. Thank you.
Prof. Fikeni, your closing statement. I think he might have.
Well, thank you, Bear.
Oh, we can hear you now, yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you,
Yes.
but I guess the problem you are experiencing is the fact that the delays in the issuing of spectrum licenses are affecting your ability to effectively participate in this session.
If then the network is too poor, I'll just abandon the participation. But if you can hear, I will just raise it. You can signal to me.
Yes.
Yes. I just want to say there are two.
No, I think.
How do we account for the peculiar structural problems, which are legacy problems of South Africa, of colonialism and apartheid, and the current? Okay.
Yeah.
I'll just write a note, but I'll stop there.
No, apologies, Prof. I think really, as I say, we now bearing the fruit of delays in the issuing of spectrum licenses, and or it might as well be that you are somewhere in the village. It's almost at noon now, so the cows might be rubbing against the network.
It's in Pretoria.
Or in the capital.
Pretoria.
Okay.
Yeah.
No, okay. No, thanks. Baroness, we're about to end. We did a SNAP survey at the beginning of this session. We asked those who joined in earlier to participate, and we asked them these questions. How many generations does it take to go from being low to income to middle income country? As you can see, most people think in 5 years, you can move from being a low to a middle income country. Others think, it could take 10 years, others is 20. But most interestingly, most people are signaling that in South Africa in particular, we do not have the luxury of time. Whereas in some countries, it may take a generation or two. There is a degree of impatience in South Africa. People believe that it should take 5 years. What holds societies together significantly for us as a public service, the issue of effective governance is coming up. But as you can see, that most people believe that the ability of social partners to make compromises is what holds society together, and is something that you had emphasized in your interventions. And second last, can compact be inclusive, or there are elite imaginations? And the majority of people say, yeah, they can indeed be inclusive. And lastly, what will it take for the youth to have a better life than their parents? Most people here say quality of education from ECD to post-secondary education is what it will take to move the youth into a situation where they live lives that are better than those of their parents. So I will end there, give it to you to then round up and we close. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Principal Nakawena. I have to say those survey results were very compelling, and clearly there's great wisdom in this audience, and I very much agree with the findings. I mean, just to step back for a moment, in some ways, you know, the first great social compact in South Africa was the post-apartheid constitution, which was held up as a model for many, many countries in the world as an example of an incredibly progressive social contract. Arguably, the promise of that hasn't been fully delivered, but I think I was really, pleased to hear Professor Leholola, who said this is a perfect moment to rethink and to think about a new set of solutions to deliver on the promise of that social contract. And I'm delighted that if any way my book can help that debate in South Africa, I would be thrilled about that. Much of the debate has been focused on the nexus between education and employment and incomes. And, you know, I think that reflects, you know, the biggest social challenges in South Africa today, which is very high rates of unemployment, very high levels of inequality, and very poor growth prospects. And I think those three issues are at the core of what a better social contract needs to deliver. And we've talked a lot this morning about what the elements of that could be. You know, the government needs to do a much better job of delivering infrastructure and skills and education without corruption, and that we need to see a much stronger link between education and employment being effective. I just want to say a brief word about trust, because many of you raised the issues around corruption, disappointment, feeling like government hasn't delivered on its promise. I mean, I think there are two key elements of trust. One is to tell the truth, and two is to deliver what you promise. And arguably, many governments in the world have disappointed their populations on those two issues. But in some ways, it's a very, you know, to rebuild trust, one needs to do both those things, tell the truth and deliver on what you promise. And the people in this audience are incredibly well positioned to help on delivering what government has promised, and to make sure that the truth is told through transparent reporting to the public. You all have an important role to play, but so does every citizen. You know, we don't really think about it very much, but every one of us participates in the social contract every day. Everything from how we divide up work in our households, to whether we pay our taxes transparently and honestly, to how we support people in need in our communities, to how we vote. All of those are ways in which we participate in the social contract. But I would say that this particular audience has a special role because many of you are in policy making roles or in policy influencing roles that can shape that social contract going forward. So you can do something about it. And I think the sentiment in the survey that the social partners compromising is the key to a better society is spot on. And all of us are part of that social partners. I wanted to also just thank Principal Nakaweni for inviting me and for chairing and organizing this event, and to Minister Gordon for suggesting it. And it's been such an honor and pleasure for me. The final thing I'd say is that the National School of Government in South Africa and the London School of Economics and Political Science share a common mission, which is to educate people to have a positive impact on the world. And if there's anything we can do at the LSE to support you as you support, educate, train, and empower a generation of leaders in South Africa to do their work better, we'd be happy to help you with that. So thank you very much for inviting me.
Thank you very much. Let me thank all the colleagues who were part of organizing this. I'll ask them to turn on their videos, the colleagues of the National School of Government, Minister Godan, Prof. Fikeni, Prof. Lehotla, and Hatem as well, and other colleagues at the LSC. If you can show your videos just the way. of appreciating your contribution towards organizing this masterclass today. We are hoping to have more engagement with some of the leading scholars at the London School of Economics. We are bringing cutting edge programs because we believe that by having sessions like this, public servants, both elected and appointed, would have an opportunity to sharpen perspective, to understand what is happening in other parts of the world. I always argue that sometimes as a bureaucrat myself, I encounter a problem and I think it's the worst problem I've ever encountered. Whereas someone else in the world, it could be in Chile, it could be in Indonesia, has encountered the same problem and solved it. So instead of me having sleepless nights, pushing my colleagues at the National School of Government to have sleepless nights for weeks on end, you might in fact find breakthroughs if you understand how other public services have been solving problems across the world, including solving policy problems, because this conversation today is about a particular policy discourse which is currently unfolding here in South Africa. So we appreciate, Baroness, your generosity, the 2 hours you've given us to come here this morning. All our panelists, unfortunately, Dr. Leyoka had to leave. She's got another meeting, but everybody's contribution here is acknowledged. We will touch base again. There are more masterclasses that are coming in the second half of the year. We are shifting gear. We're going to be bringing a lot more people, engineers and project managers, because we need to deal with execution issues. As many people say, South Africa has great policies. The problem is execution. We'll be bringing those experts with public sector experience to engage on issues of execution. Thank you very much, and please have a good weekend further. Thank you. Please remember to serve, learn, grow, which is the motto of the National School of Government. Thank you and bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Thank you.